Greetings, Captains! I am Yusril, and this is a look at the recently revamped, revitalised, remastered and re-released Crystalline Entity Fleet Action for Star Trek Online. A bit of history first. The original CE Fleet Action was in Star Trek Online almost from the beginning, and was notorious, to put it mildly, for requiring near-perfect execution from everyone in the team. A good group could kill it in under 3 minutes, and I believe 12th Fleet has the record at 2 minutes 28 seconds, but because of a particular healing mechanic the Entity had, pugs could, and often did, take 2 hours to get precisely nowhere. Happily, well, maybe, this has been changed, and the new Crystalline Entity is eminently puggable. Let's break it down. The Entity itself has about 2.5 million health, and a very high weapon resistance. It appears to be on the order of 90% for energy weapons and somewhat lower for kinetic damage. Why it wasn't just given 25 million health is something I have wondered about, but I assume Cryptic had their reasons. It also has an anti-proton beam, and twice during the fight will charge and release an anti-proton shockwave that hits everything within 10 kilometers. It can also spawn large crystalline fragments, and being a living being rather than a starship, it has no subsystems or energy levels, which means that quite a few abilities and weapon procs do absolutely nothing to it. Finally, it can regenerate health, about 3% every 30 to 40 seconds, so a couple of ships pew-pewing won't actually do much more than annoy it. The large fragments have about 50,000 health, but they've got no particular weapon resistance. They will lock onto a given player, ignoring NPC entities like fighters and torpedoes, and attempt to get within about 1 kilometre of their chosen victim. When a fragment manages this, it will explode, dealing a fairly hefty wallop to the victim, and spawning 3 small crystalline fragments. The damage appears to be physical damage, and goes right through shields. Fortunately, it's not enough to one-shot a player, but don't let several of these hit you in quick succession. The small fragments are puny, less than 4,000 health each, but they're awkward to target with the mouse, and they also seem to have a defense bonus. They will attempt to get back to the Entity, and if they do, well, that's when the fun can start. Each small fragment will add a buff called recrystallization, which increases the Entity's damage output. Oh, and this buff stacks. Fortunately, it can be removed by various abilities: Tachyon Beam, Charged Particle Burst, Energy Siphon and Tychon's Rift, although it's not yet clear if variations like the Breen Energy Dissipator or the Tachyon Inversion Beam will work on it. Finally, we have the Tholians. These guys are present at the start of the mission and appear periodically. They're really more of a nuisance than anything, mostly thanks to disruption torpedoes shutting down weapons, but they can build up to a threat if ignored. Oddly, they don't seem to have their web abilities in this mission. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but it might just be that the instance is already fairly crowded, and Cryptic didn't want to push the engine too hard. So, how does the fight play out? You start with the group warping in about 40 kilometers from the Entity, and there is a small Tholian squadron in attendance. Admiral Yanishev will pop up to offer some advice, and the usual opening move is to clear away the Tholians, if only because they're in the way. The Entity will start firing off its anti-proton beam and releasing large fragments, while the players pew-pew away, destroy any fragments they can, and strip any recrystallization stacks that build up. The first time the Entity is reduced to 2/3 health, it will start an absorption phase. More Tholians will warp in, and your science officers will warn you to stop shooting at the Entity. They've got a point here: you won't actually do any damage to it in this phase. There are 2 ways to handle this encounter. Firstly, we have the Picard version: nice, safe, and by the book. You follow your science officer's advice, you beat on the Tholians, and you get more than 10 kilometers away from the Entity. This effectively neutralises the pulse, and because there's no particular weapons fire going towards the entity, even if you aren't out of range when it goes off, you shouldn't take too much damage. Meanwhile, the Tholians are kept under control, and you can go back to beating on the entity when the pulse is fired. On the other hand, we have the Kirk version. Keep blazing away at the entity, maybe even allow it to get a few stacks of recrystallization for extra effect. Ramp the shockwave as high as it will go and bait the Tholians into range, then make sure you're out of range at the last second. Done correctly, the blast will take out the Tholians. Done incorrectly, well, I'm sure Fleet will send your next of kin an invitation to the funeral. With the shockwave done, no matter how you choose to handle it, normal business resumes until the entity gets down to 1/3 health for the first time, when it will, surprise surprise, trigger another absorption phase and more Tholians. With that done, it's back to normal business once more until the entity finally explodes, the loot gets handed out, and the mission ends. There's nothing wildly complex about the new entity, and unlike the old one, it's near impossible to get stuck. Standard loadouts will work for most purposes, although it's worth noting a couple of key points. Remember that I said earlier, the entity does not have shields, subsystems, or power levels, and anything that affects those areas will basically have no effect on the entity. Practical consequences of this: Phaser, Polaron, and Tetrion weapon procs have no effect. Disruptor, Anti-Proton, and Plasma procs do still work, making Dizzies and Anti-Protons probably the best energy weapons for this encounter. Plasma fire can carry over into the absorbed phase, which can, quite literally, backfire on you. You can also forget things like Target Subsystem along with most power and shield drain abilities, with notable exceptions being the 4 that strip recrystallization. As for the rest of your loadout, torpedoes and the kinetic cutting beam, which is, I remind you, the only 360-degree kinetic weapon in the game, are a good idea, so even if you normally don't bother with those, you might want to change your weapons fit a little. Mines also do kinetic damage, but they do require you to get within 2 kilometers of the entity, which makes dodging large shards just a little bit awkward. Since most of the entity's damage is anti-proton, it's also worth investing in some resistance consoles for, well, anti-protons. However, you can take all of this to the logical extreme. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Nasty Kitty, an attempt to work out just how many kinetic weapons can be practically deployed on one ship. Cue the Romulan and Omega plasma torpedoes, a tricobalt tube, the cutting beam, 2 hangar bays of fighters with their own torpedoes, plus the Mako heavy graviton beam, the 3 set from the Starfleet Borg space set. Not to mention a gravity well for even more kinetic damage, not to mention fragment control as well, Tychon's Rift to strip recrystallization stacks and a little bit of kinetic damage, and tractor repulsors if the fragments do somehow get within 5 kilometers, or you happen to get within 5 kilometers of the entity and want to shove out some more kinetic damage. Alternative hulls are the Vokouv and the various flight deck cruisers on the Klingon side, and the Armitage and possibly a heavy cruiser hull on the Federation side. If you're going with something that has 4 weapons forward, I'd suggest a second tricobalt launcher. The 2 plasma torpedoes do have a shared cooldown, so you'll find yourself using manual firing to stop the various weapons tripping over each other. If you're used to automatic firing, then the resulting finger dance will take a bit of getting used to, but it does seem to work quite nicely. My opinion of the mission? Well, it's a nice diversion, it seems reasonably bug-free, and the current special project, namely repeat it once a day for 14 of the first 21 days it's available, makes for a relatively quick and easy way to pick up some extra dilithium. I have to wonder, however, if people are going to carry on playing it once they are done with the grind, because I couldn't help but feel it could usefully be a bit, well, much harder. The large fragments in particular are only a minor irritation in the actual mission, when a hit from one is described as tearing the USS Pollux in half in Devblog 43. If I could make one change to the mission, therefore, it would be to massively increase the damage from the large fragments, so people actually had to take blocking those seriously, and the entity isn't simply a loot pinata dressed up as a DPS race. My only other gripe is actually with the broader engine. It sometimes seems to struggle with this scenario, as it does with other large battles such as the 20-player star-based defence. If you watch the footage, you'll notice some things, most obviously quantum torpedoes and cannon fire, not properly rendering. I suspect this may be why the Tholians don't use their web abilities in this scenario, and it does rather level some criticism at the engine's object limit if that's the case. If it isn't, of course, I'm open to other explanations. It's a general problem with the game, though. It just happens to pop up here. Overall, though, I'm impressed. It plays well, it's a nice rework of content that was rarely if ever played before, and hopefully the Crystalline entity will have a happy time being repeatedly blown to bits by random starship captains instead of floating around the galaxy all on its own. Or maybe it won't, but who cares? Regardless of that, I am Yusril, that has been the remastered Crystalline entity, and until next time, farewell.